The Gemini Method. In the late 1970s, a neighborhood bar on Flatlands Avenue in Brooklyn became one of the most efficient killing floors in American mob history. The Gemini Lounge was owned by Roy DeMeo, a Gambino crime family soldier who had learned to cut meat as a butcher's apprentice before he ever learned to cut people. DeMeo ran a crew of roughly 20 men. They dealt in stolen cars, drugs, and murder. But what set them apart was their method. Victims were lured through a side door into an apartment behind the bar. The crew called it the clubhouse. Inside, DeMeo kept everything he needed: guns, ropes, knives, plastic sheets. The process was always the same. DeMeo would step out with a silenced pistol and shoot the victim in the head. Another crew member immediately wrapped the wound in a towel to contain the blood. Then someone stabbed the victim in the heart. The human heart has its own electrical system. It keeps pumping even after brain death. The stab stopped that. The body was hung upside down in the bathtub and left to drain. Once empty, it was laid on plastic, dismembered with knives and saws, bagged, and sent to the Fountain Avenue landfill in Brooklyn. The crew is believed to have killed up to 200 people this way. In January 1983, DeMeo was found shot dead in the trunk of his own car. His own family had ordered the hit. The man who built a system to make bodies disappear became a body in a trunk. Power drill torture. In the early 1990s, Philadelphia's mob was tearing itself apart. Boss John Stanfar was at war with Joey Molino's younger faction, and his most reliable killer was a South Philly street fighter named John Vesey. Vesey had already murdered for Stanfar. He had already proved what he was willing to do. But it was what he did to a man named Joe Fudge that showed exactly how far he could go. Fudge was a mob associate who had been telling anyone who would listen that he was going to kill Vesey. The threat spread through the streets quickly. They reached Vesey within days. There was a problem. Vesey was under house arrest at the time. He couldn't leave, so he had another mobster bring Fudge to him. When Fudge walked through the door, Vesey was waiting with a power drill hooked up to a 50-foot extension cord. He hit Fudge in the face with the drill first. The paddle tip caught his hair and ripped out thick clumps from his scalp. Then Vesey went to work on the joints, elbows first, then hips, then knees. He also beat him across the legs with a baseball bat. Midway through, the phone rang. An automated call from the probation department. Vesey picked up with one hand and kept drilling with the other. The system asked him to recite state names to verify his identity: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. Each word spoken calmly while Fudge screamed on the floor. When it was over, Vesey handed Fudge a loaded gun and told him to go ahead. Fudge couldn't move. Vesey threw him out onto the street. Blowtorch torture. In Chicago, the outfit had no shortage of violent men, but none of them enjoyed it quite like Samuel "Mad Sam" DeStefano. He was one of the most successful loan sharks in the city's history. He charged 20 to 25% interest per week. And unlike other lenders who wanted reliable borrowers, DeStefano preferred the ones who couldn't pay. He wanted them to fail. That was the part he looked forward to. A debtor named Cappelletti had stolen money owed to DeStefano. His men tracked Cappelletti down in Wisconsin and dragged him back to Chicago. DeStefano chained him to a radiator. Then the torture began. It lasted 3 days. While Cappelletti burned and screamed in a back room, a banquet was being held on the other side of the wall. Guests ate and drank and laughed while the man begged for death just feet away. At one point, Cappelletti cried out that he was on fire. He pleaded to be killed. DeStefano told him they needed to put the fire out. Then he ordered his men to drag the severely burned man into the dining room. In front of the guests, DeStefano forced Cappelletti's own family to urinate on him. The family paid back every dollar immediately. DeStefano operated like this for years. FBI agent William Romer called him the worst torture murderer in the history of Chicago. Fellow gangsters said he foamed at the mouth during sessions. In 1973, his own co-defendants had him shotgunned in his garage. They feared his behavior in court would get them all convicted. Basement torture chambers. Mad. Sam DeStefano didn't just torture people when the situation called for it. He built a permanent facility for it. In the basement of his Chicago home, he soundproofed the walls, installed heavy locks, and stocked the room with tools, ice picks, hammers, electrical devices. Everything he needed was always ready. The basement served one purpose. When a debtor fell behind on payments, DeStefano would invite them over to discuss the situation. The conversation always moved downstairs. Once the door closed, nobody outside could hear a thing. DeStefano deliberately lent money to drug addicts, gamblers, and businessmen who had already defaulted on other loans. He wanted high-risk clients. He wanted them to miss a payment. That gave him a reason to bring them to the basement. Other gangsters said he actually foamed at the mouth while working on victims. One associate claimed he once found DeStefano rolling on the floor, shouting to Satan that he was his servant. There were persistent rumors that he worshipped the devil. One of his victims was restaurant owner Artie Adler, who was late on a single payment. DeStefano brought him downstairs and went to work. Another victim, Leo Foreman, was lured to DeStefano's brother's house, beaten with a hammer, stabbed repeatedly with an ice pick, then shot and stuffed into a car trunk. Despite earning enormous money for the outfit, DeStefano was never made a full member. He was too unstable, too unpredictable. Even by the standards of the Chicago mob, the man with the soundproofed basement was considered dangerously insane. Lupara Bianca. In Sicily, the Mafia had a term for the cleanest kind of murder. Lupara Bianca, white shotgun. It meant a killing where the body was never found. No funeral, no evidence, no closure. The victim simply vanished. The methods varied. Some bodies were buried in remote countryside, others were encased in concrete at construction sites, but the most effective technique was acid. Sulfuric acid dissolved flesh, bone, and clothing until nothing remained. Mafia informants later bragged to investigators that a body could disappear in as little as 15 minutes. Forensic scientists would eventually prove that was an exaggeration. But the results were undeniable. Hundreds of people vanished during the Sicilian Mafia wars of the early 1980s and were never seen again. The most horrific case involved a child. On November 23, 1993, men disguised as police officers approached 12-year-old Giuseppe Di Matteo. They told him they were taking him to see his father. His father, Santino, was a mafia soldier who had been arrested and become the first of Judge Giovanni Falcone's assassins to cooperate with authorities. The kidnapping was ordered by Giovanni Brusca, known as the Slaughterer. Giuseppe was held for 779 days. Over 2 years of captivity, his captors tortured him and sent photographs of their work to his father. By the end, the boy was physically ill and too weak to resist. On January 11, 1996, they strangled him. Then they dissolved his body in a barrel of acid. He was 13 years old. There was nothing left to bury. Concrete shoes. If there is one image that defines the American Mafia in the public imagination, it is concrete shoes. A man with his feet encased in cement dropped into deep water, sinking without a trace. It appeared in novels, films, and television for decades. Everyone knew the method. The problem was that for nearly a century, there was no confirmed case of it actually happening. The legend traces back to the 1930s. Abe Bo Weinberg was a Jewish mobster who worked for Prohibition boss Dutch Schultz in New York. In 1935, Weinberg disappeared. The story that followed said Schultz had him killed and dumped in the East River wearing cement shoes. His body was never found. The tale became gospel. In 1964, hitman turned informant Ernest Rupolo was pulled from Jamaica Bay with concrete blocks tied to his legs. Close, but not quite the same thing. Historians, law enforcement, and even retired detectives all said the same thing. It was a myth. Impractical. Too slow. What gangster was going to sit around waiting for cement to harden while a victim thrashed and fought? Then in May 2016, a body washed ashore near Manhattan Beach in Brooklyn. His name was Peter Martinez, 28 years old, a gang member known on the streets as Petey Crack. His arms were tied behind his back, his head was wrapped in duct tape, his feet were encased in poured concrete inside a 5-gallon bucket. A veteran Brooklyn detective took one look at the scene. The concrete was full of air pockets, a sloppy pour, amateur work. The myth had finally become real, and the execution was a mess. Genital mutilation interrogations. The Chicago outfit understood that certain kinds of pain broke a man faster than others. When they needed information and needed it quickly, they targeted the most vulnerable parts of the body. It was deliberate. It was systematic. And it worked. In 1962, two young burglars named Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia made a fatal mistake. They killed two connected men in Elmwood Park, a quiet suburb where the outfit's top bosses lived. The neighborhood was strictly off limits to crime. The bosses wanted the killers found and dealt with. Tony Spilotro was assigned the job. He was young, eager, and desperate to earn his button. His men captured McCarthy first. Spilotro wanted the name of his partner. McCarthy refused to talk. So Spilotro went to work. He stabbed McCarthy through the testicles with ice picks. He beat him for 3 days straight. When that still wasn't enough, he placed McCarthy's head in a vise and began to squeeze. He tightened it slowly, methodically, until one of McCarthy's eyeballs burst from its socket. McCarthy gave up Miraglia's name and begged to be killed. Spilotro slit his throat, then hunted down Miraglia and did the same. A year earlier, the same kind of targeted brutality was used on William Action Jackson. Outfit enforcers used a cattle prod on his genitals repeatedly during a multi-day interrogation at a meat rendering plant. Jackson screamed that he was not an informant. He was telling the truth. The outfit had tortured and mutilated a loyal man over a suspicion that turned out to be wrong. Meat hook torture. On August 9, 1961, William Action Jackson was picked up by fellow mobsters on Chicago's South Side. Jackson was a 300-pound enforcer and juice collector for the outfit. He earned his nickname because he specialized in pain. When borrowers fell behind, Jackson was the man who showed up at their door. He was loyal. He had turned down the FBI when they tried to recruit him as an informant. But the outfit didn't believe that. Someone had whispered that Jackson was a rat. That was enough. They took him to a meat rendering plant. The men waiting inside included Fiore Fifi, Buccieri Jackie Cerrone, Jimmy Turk Torello, and Mad Sam DeStefano. They impaled Jackson through his rectum on a steel meat hook and hung him a foot off the ground. He was so heavy he bent the hook. Then the work began. They smashed his kneecaps with baseball bats, broke his ribs, stabbed him with ice picks, burned him with a blowtorch. They doused him with water to improve conductivity, then used a cattle prod on him. Jackson kept insisting he was innocent. They kept going. For 3 days, he hung from that hook. FBI wiretaps later captured Buccieri giggling about the murder. He said Jackson's screams were so loud they made him laugh until he feared a heart attack. On August 12th, Jackson's body was found in the trunk of his own Cadillac on Lower Wecker Drive. He was barely recognizable. The outfit later learned the truth. Jackson had never been an informant. They had butchered a loyal man for nothing.